to From No to Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. For nearly 100 years, Rube Goldberg machines have captured the public imagination. From comic strips in the 1920s to TikTok in the 2020s, our fascination with seeing an intricately complex contraption perform the simplest of functions never fails to entertain us. But can it be more than entertainment? Perhaps these machines are demonstrating an important philosophical position. If you're the type of curmudgeon who asks why someone would go through all the effort to build such a machine when the task could be performed much more simply, then you have a working understanding of Occam's razor.
That's a really good start.
So, yeah, Occam's razor, I think that probably a lot of listeners are familiar with it, but I think that the normal formulation of the principle is misstated very often. So
it is.
There's some interesting stuff in here for sure. What is Occam's razor?
Well, Occam's razor is, I'm going to really boil it down and what can build it back up. Occam's razor is the notion that you shave away, you cut out any complexity that doesn't necessarily seem to need to be in a proposition in order to, or an explanatory paradigm in order to make it work. And it was associated with William of Occam, spelled variously, in times medieval, who was a philosopher, not spot on with all of the different categories he talked about, but a major player at the time. But he never really actually said that. But he talked about the idea of parsimony, which is an old word for being stingy. And so this is idea stinginess, really, but it goes all the way back to the first ancient philosophers.
Yeah, I was about to say, when I was doing research for it, Aristotle was even known to say some variation of, keep your ideas simple if you can.
Yeah. No assumptions should be. Don't make unnecessary assumptions. Now that sounds great on the surface, but all the complexity in that.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that it can be traced all the way back to Aristotle, and then variously. There's a strong thread of it throughout history. It makes you wonder when that idea did first occur. Because it doesn't seem to be something that is necessarily self-evident, in that sort of way where, the way that they use a lot is adding ad hoc hypotheses, right? So basically, if you just keep saying, well, hey, this hypothesis will work if I add this, then you can make almost anything right. So it seems like if you were an early thinker, you'd almost say, well, complexity is a good thing, right? Because if we just keep adding on, we'll eventually get to the answer. But that wasn't the case. From a very early time, they knew, no, if you have a small number of assumptions, you're more likely to be right.
And Occam himself was known for a couple of isms, one being nominalism, which and reductionism, which often has a negative connotation. But nominalism is the idea that universals really don't mean much. There's no corresponding meaning. They're just a word, which is interesting because he was a devout God worshiper. So,
yeah.
And so you take the concept, but we've talked about the concept of God before, but it's interesting that so nominalism is about giving names. And so you're looking at, the nominalist wants properties, wants numbers, wants data, and wants things to be more specific. But then the nominalist essentially says, okay, but keep the specifics that are necessary, but not the specifics that aren't.
Yeah. This is it's interesting because this goes into crosses over into like audio production in a lot of ways. One thing that you get warned about when you're doing mixing for music or for a podcast or anything really is that you don't want to overdo it. And it's hard to tell when that point is. If you start using tools, your EQs and your compressions and your saturators and stuff, there's this temptation where your ears, each change you make, your ears get used to it. And so as you keep making changes, your ears keep getting used to it. And to you, it keeps sounding like it's getting better and better. But to somebody who's never heard it, or if you were to walk away and come back, all of a sudden you realize, ooh, this sounds really unnatural and strange because I've done too much. And usually what happens is you get too much noise into the signal, right? If you're trying to make it sound good by making it appeal to the human hearing range, but then the saturation kind of builds up and it's almost sort of staticky or harsh,
That's a good paradigm. I have a parallel one from being an artist. One of the lessons I was taught and continue to have handed to me gently, kindly, and wonderfully by my art teacher is choose the minimal color that you need. With one color, the values of one color, you can do an incredible piece. But if you need a variety of colors, okay. But there's a point at which you can oversaturate. When I do photography and I put things, I try to adjust the exposure and the brightness and saturation, all of those things. You can lose yourself in that. But you sort of walk through and see what each one of these things do and to learn it, but then no, I don't want that. This a little bit. And it's not this like arbitrary, well, I'll just slide the scale over this far and that'll be fine. You're seeing what the eye tells you. Is this too busy? Does it render the piece more compelling or just disrupt it? And I think that's the better side of Occam.
Yeah, I think that's a very good parallel. It's very similar in audio mixing as it is with photo editing. And almost everybody has experience with that on their phones, editing, photos and stuff. That idea that, and the principle applies, right? You want to make the smallest number of changes to make the photo look good. Because if you make too many, everybody knows what it looks like. It just starts to look very strange, very too busy, But then the question of, well, what is the minimum number of changes? Why do I need to make any changes at all, right? If I take the photo, isn't that technically mission accomplished, right? I captured what the lens was actually picking up. But aesthetically, right?
Right, aesthetically, no.
We go, I think there's one of two mindsets, right? You either say, I'm going to edit this to try to make it more representational of what the photo originally looked like. So, maybe you add some warmth to it, or you add a little bit of contrast or something, and you go, well, this is more what my eye saw as opposed to what the camera captured. But then I think the other motivation, rather than realism, would be idealism, right? Would be to say, okay, well, this isn't what I've edited the picture into is not what my eye saw, but this would be the perfect picture, right? The ideal, right? The platonic ideal of what this picture could be, right?
Yes. And then you have the other side of the aesthetic, which is to say, I'm not trying to be representational. I'm seeing, it's part of what I like to do. I use all kinds of mediums, but one of the things I like to do is when my eye catches something that shows me in the mundane something extraordinary. And this past week I was taking diptych shots, shots with two pieces in one, which amounted to two slabs of sidewalk going into the YMCA in my town. And because of all the salt and dirt and flow from snow melt and rain where we live, incredible patterns. And just an example in one, and I saw this thing that looked something like a figure. And I wanted to reveal that figure. because it's part of my artistic intention. Is there are extraordinary things in the very ordinary we don't cast a second glance to. So that wasn't being representational, but it was using the tools to lure out. So in essence, you are using an X-ray device or a mass spectrometer or whatever, infrared, whatever it is, to say, oh, well, if I adjust the color, but even with photography, I've had the good fortune of being with many photographers. My brother's a photographer. People at the college that I used to teach at were first rate, and black and white photography. There was a whole debate about black and white photography. Well, that's not really what the world looks like. Well, then you're strictly representational, and that's not. And so if we take Occam's razor and say, well, I just want the simplest picture of this, whatever the situation happens to be, then it sounds great. I like to watch detective shows too and everything, but usually there are extraneous things that by the excising of them, by cutting them out, you might be missing something.
Yeah, and so we'll get back into the main portion of the podcast, but I think we've entered a really interesting space that I didn't anticipate, and I like we always do, and it makes me wonder, right? Can Occam's razor be applied to aesthetics? Because I think in a representational sense, I can see a place for it, right? Okay, making the minimal number of changes to try to re-represent what was seen. Okay, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But when you go to that other side, when you go from realism or representationalism into idealism is that's seems to me to be purely subjective, right? Because idealism to one person might be, a perfect, okay, well, this isn't what my eyes saw, but this would be a perfect way of representing what this would look like. This is the ideal of this photo. But for somebody else, that ideal will be completely different. And like you said, depending on the creativity and the headspace of the person doing the editing, it could be very different, right? It could be something that is not at all representational, something that becomes almost abstracted in a certain way. That might be their ideal termination point of the editing process. So
you want to give an impression. You want to do an impression, and you want to have ultimate tension in a piece of music that you're writing.
Yeah,
and you know so well because you make such. I am happy to say it's remarkable music, but I know you make choices, and I think of movie soundtracks. There are all kinds of ways to make tension part of the sound. In one of the plays that I've been reading over the past year, there is a signature that is still used in the theater with the play. And it's a single guitar string pluck and break. And that's the most tense moment in the play. Just one. There's sometimes music in it, but that's just incredible.
Yeah. I think about John Williams with the Jaws theme, right? 2 notes. It's just 2 notes, but with an ever ascending tempo, right? Dun-na, 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 dun. That's sort of Occam's razor in an aesthetic sense, right? What's the minimal number of elements that you need to portray what you're trying to portray? Well, 2 notes and an increasing tempo. I mean, it's hard to break it down to fewer elements than that.
There's a marvelous musician that I know. I've known her mother forever. Her name is Zoe Keating, and she's known worldwide, and she does soundtracks for films and so on. She like everyone was sidelined in the pandemic, but got back out there and did a concert in an empty hall. She's an amazing person, and Zoe primarily cello. tapping on the cello, stringing on the cello, plucking the pizzicato, all kinds of things. She's done some very interesting horror film, tense music, just with that. So that's a minimalism.
Hmm.
Or as my art teacher would say, it's a choice of unlimited range that opens up unlimited possibilities because of limitations. So this takes us back to what we were talking about, really a couple of weeks ago. The idea that you can, last week you can jute-sing, you can get right outside of the box entirely.
Yeah. So, what do you? Has there been examples of Occam's razor used in aesthetics historically, or has it mostly been? We know that it's been used in scientific and in philosophical thought,
right.
But has there been attempts to use it aesthetically, or have most people considered it to be outside of its usefulness?
I've never, and cautiously, as one person, as an academic, I'm pretty well read, but I haven't yet encountered someone who refers specifically to Occam's razor as a rule of thumb for art. It's probable that it's out there. It's just like, Russell's teacup out around Jupiter or something. But I haven't, but it certainly makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think that it has uses, especially like we were talking about in representational media specifically. But in creative outlets as well, like we were just talking about with the Jaws theme, or I think I've talked about on the show even a couple times. Sometimes the best way to write or to spark creativity in a writing process is to actually set limitations, right? Mm-hmm. And when we were looking at Dennett last week, he said, you had that example of, sit down at a piano and try to write a melody, right? You have endless possibilities. You could write anything, right? But it's so hard to come up with something good. Like, it's much easier to come up with something good if you take a known commodity and then try to change it in some way to make it something new, Mm-hmm. So why was there a need for Occam's razor to be developed? Where was this impetus? We have this thread running throughout history that the simpler answer is going to be the best one.
I think out of a sense of intentional, maybe at first unconscious, but I think it very quickly becomes intentional. An intentional caution to use an old metaphor, to rein the horses in just a little bit, to keep the kids not just running down the street, but getting in the car when Grandpa wants them to. It's to say, okay, that's a lot of energy. That's fine, but where is this going to take us? I mean, there's some really interesting examples. I'm sure you've run into them. Well, they're so mundane, but they're wonderful. When you hear hoofbeats, don't first think zebras,
right?
Unless you happen to be living in a place where there are herds of zebras, right? You think horses, or if you see a figure, I love this one. It's been out there quite a while. You see ants manipulating, moving around in the sand, and you end up seeing a famous figure like it's often he's Winston Churchill, and do you assume that the ants have purposefully made Winston Churchill, or do you assume it's just a coincidence and you're making a pattern in your head? So I think it's a cautionary, be creative, go nuts for a little bit, but then when you're done with all that brainstorming, try to go to the thing that seems most reasonable at the moment.
Yeah, the thing that requires the least number of elements to explain what you're observing.
And I think it's cautionary in our own time, but I think probably for any number of reasons back through. Well, try to encapsulate it all isn't going to work. But any times when like for instance when the church was governing everything and people had enough and were pushing back, or when in the Enlightenment when science is coming back and going further than ever before, and rationality is in the fore. You are having a major collision of agendas. And Occam's razor, well applied, can help with this. So I think it's cautionary across the ages. I think at particular times in history, significant clashes arise, which are usually ideological or politically based or theologically based, and there needs to be some explanation to back people off and say, well, let's really look at this. So in our own time, I think it's particularly useful in conspiracy theory dismantling.
Yeah.
Leaping to conclusion, leaping to assumptions.
Yeah, and there's things that go along with Occam's razor that help you identify that. Like I mentioned earlier, the ad hoc hypothesis, which is, if you come up with a theory, right, and then a hole is shot in that theory, if you, rather than abandoning the theory or reformulating it, if you then just add in something else that patches the hole, right, and then another hole gets shot in, and then you patch that hole until you just have this patchwork thing, and you say, well, it's holding water, so it must be true. And you go, well, you could have just had a one-piece boat, rather than trying to, sew together tin cans.
Cartoons do this all the time. Mickey Mouse cartoons or what have you. I was watching something with my granddaughter the other day. It's a whole series of Tinkerbell, fairy stories. But there's a roof leak. It's the exact thing you're talking about in this cottage in early 20th century England, and for this girl that the fairy has been captured by, and blah blah blah. But to get the fairy wants to help the little girl, and so she's going to fix the roof. But she tinkers a fix that involves a Rube Goldberg machine guiding the water down to a pail, which then spills out through a hole in the floor. It's like, okay, all right, that's exactly it. There would be a simpler way to do it. Yeah,
and that's sort of a good representation of most conspiracy theories, right? You come up with this premise, whatever it is, that there's lizards running the government or something, and that's pretty easy to falsify on face value. So then you just continue adding more and more complex and convoluted elements to it until you go, well, you can't disprove it. And that's part of what Occam's razor is useful for, is it using the least number of elements provides in a very important scientific principle for hypothesis, which is falsifiability. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In order for something to be considered scientific, it has to be falsifiable, right? You have to be able to say, we're going to test this and actually see if it holds water. Well,
yes.
If I tell you that the way that you're listening to this podcast is, there's a leprechaun shouting it from the top of a water tower and it's coming to your ears that way, well, you might say, well, no, it's not. It's coming over electricity that's easy to say, but electricity is really just leprechaun. You just keep going on and on. You can't falsify it because every time I just add an ad hoc hypothesis that prevents it from being falsified. Right. That's not really a great way to go about thinking.
Don't multiply entities beyond necessity. That's another way that Occam's razor has been expressed. Well, let's see. We got leprechauns, we got fairies, we got everything. All right. And it's fun. It is fun. And there's something unscientifically joyful in folklore. But one knows it's folklore. Another Occam's razor example is, well, if somebody's reading, doing a tarot reading, and it happens, they tell you something that you find is, oh, that was right about me. They must supernatural told them, and they told me. Now, I'm trying to be careful about this because I am not bashing spiritualism. Lilydale is a fascinating place. One can have experiences one can't necessarily explain to one's own satisfaction. But one can still find simpler explanations that So you can live in that realm. Mrs. Roosevelt once talked about where you can hold two opposing ideas at the same time, but something inside you tells you, yeah, it's probably this simpler one.
Yeah.
Not always, because then it can be misused. And again, I'm trying to tread carefully, but it can be, it's Occam's razor like to say, well, we don't need all these physics and metaphysics explanations of quantum universe. God created the universe. That's so much simpler than looking at all this stuff. But it isn't, because it doesn't explain anything.
Right. Yeah, and that is an important point, is that Occam's razor is not a scientific what am I looking for? It's not a scientific thing. It's a principle.
It's a rule of thumb.
It's a rule of thumb. Yes, it's a principle. And so, and yeah, there's lots of places where that gets sort of murky, right? Like I'm taking neuroscience this semester. And so going through the history of neuroscience, they say, well, when they used to dissect human brains back in, the Middle Ages, they'd open it up and they'd see these ventricles, these big open spaces inside the brain. They'd say, oh, well, we know that humans have souls, right? So here's these three ventricles, and this one is where reason is, and this one's where emotion is, and this one's where our soul is, right? But that made sense to them because it's this empty spot, and that's where it is. That's a pretty simple explanation, right? Rather than looking at sodium ion gates and sodium potassium gates and chloride and axonomic autoreceptors and all these other things, astrocytes and glial cells, and the truth is much more complex, which it appears to be a violation of Occam's razor. But like you said, the explanatory value and the evidence for the theories are important. And I think that, one thing I was reading is that Occam's razor works if you have two competing hypotheses that are trying to make the same prediction. Mm-hmm. But if you have two hypotheses that are making different predictions, you can't use Occam's razor. And so if you think about that, medieval quote unquote neuroscience versus modern neuroscience, really the predictions they're trying to make about the human being are not the same. Where the medieval surgeon was starting from and the presence of, the immaterial body is not one that is thought of as in the same way as it is in modern science. Right. So
I, just a little side note, because that was a lovely excursion. And I think it was very helpful. A little side trip, just step off the path for a minute. When we say the word rule of thumb, something needs to be clarified too, because as you said, it's at best a principle. It's another intuition pump. It's just a tool. The rule of thumb has many, the provenance, where it comes from, has many sources, but one that it wasn't, which people often refer to, which has been discounted utterly over the years, was that it was about a judge telling a man in England that he couldn't hit his wife with a rod that was thicker than his thumb. Well, that exists in no written form. It's simply an anecdotal, a misapplied anecdote. And if you think about it, a man's thumb size and a woman's thumb size generally, probably it would have been the woman's thumb, not the man, but it wasn't done. It's a fallacious statement, but rule of thumb means it goes to brewing, dipping your thumb in to check brewing. It was used in nautical terms. It's used in carpentry as what you'd think. Ruler, your thumb's a ruler. Well, how many of us have decided roughly how much square footage there is in a place by pacing?
Right.
Well, our foot is roughly a foot long. Well, some people's feet it's not exact, right? So rule of thumb is just a placeholder, not an accurate thing, but a placeholder to get you somewhere.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good because, although it's a principle, right, and it does help you get.
It's not a law.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's an important part is this idea that, you can't use Occam's razor to compare things that are not the same, right? You have to be making the same predictions. So yeah, I think that coming back to your one about, it's much easier to say God created the universe rather than having all this other stuff. I think that it's worth asking the question, are we actually asking the same question when we talk about the origins of the universe or the origins of life? If we're looking at it from a scientific view versus a theological view. And if we are asking the same questions, then Occam's razor would apply. But if we are not making the same predictions, we're not asking the same questions, then it can't really be used anyways. And if it can't be used anyways, then the two are not mutually exclusive necessarily.
And our Occam's razor can be weaponized intentionally to, again, in a purposely false way to attack things. But then there's that corollary which we've read about, which we'll get to, which is called Occam's broom.
Yeah. Yeah. Before we get there, do you want to talk about are there any other limitations or criticisms of Occam's razor we should cover?
Well, let's recap. It is an attempt to involve the minimal number of steps or entities in order to provide an explanation. It's a guide. It's not an absolute. It can be helpful, but it can also be misleading, and probably not in equal terms. But it depends entirely how carefully it's applied. So I think that, for me, that's probably enough. You probably have another thought for it.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's also, we should probably also add in something about it being contextually based, right? We talked about aesthetics earlier, right? Yeah. It's a good tool for scientific and for some aspects of philosophical thought and maybe some aspects of aesthetic thought. But we know for probably in most creative settings, it might not just be inapplicable, but even harmful to use that sort of rule. In a lot of creative processes, you're really looking for a multiplication of ideas in order to get where you want.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and linked to that, and since you've said that, it spurred some more thought in the old cranium. It's when we use the word simple, the simplest. When we say the simplest explanation, that doesn't mean that it's simple. The simplest explanation for how an eye works is still a multi-step biological, physiological, neurocognitive process. You can't reduce that to 2 steps.
Yeah.
So it's Occam's razor is, I think, necessarily tied to, if not obviously tied to, the illusion of explanatory depth again.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can tell you how a phone works. Here are 2 steps for a telephone. Okay, well, you were just talking about the electricity a moment ago. Well, no, there's more to it than that. So Occam's razor is not an out, an escape hatch for people who can't adequately explain something. I think that should be said.
Yeah, and I think that this goes back to the illustration of neuroscience, right? Where you say, oh, well, it's much simpler to say, oh, you have these ventricles in the brain and that's where your soul is. And it's much more complicated to say, oh, well, you have all of the different structures of the brain and the nervous system that I mentioned. That's way more complex. So where does Occam's razor come in? Well, I think where it comes in is, like you were saying, the key term is it's the simplest solution to explain the phenomenon. So if you were to start from and this actually happened with Da Vinci, I think. He bought an ox brain and poured wax into it to actually form a mold of the ventricles of the ox. And through that little experiment, he said, oh, you know what? These don't actually look like what the other people who are studying it says they are. And they're not filled with bile or with anything like that. So they probably don't serve the function that they were saying. And he started hypothesizing about what the purpose of the ventricles actually was, right? And so because of that scientific experiment process that he did, they needed another step in order to explain what this thing was. And so lots of times that's the way that science progresses, right? Even until very recently, they weren't sure how, like the gyrus of the brain, like when you look at the brain on the outside, you have that very sort of squiggly appearance. Until very recently, they didn't know how the cells did that, how they got there. And then they found out that, well, they actually have these glial cells that string out, and then neurons actually crawl up them to get there. And so that's a very complex thing, right?
Yes.
You can't explain that simply and then talk about how they proliferate and prune and connect and do all these different things. It is a complex process, but you need the simplest version of that very complex thing.
And you may find, and you just made an important point. If you apply Occam's razor, as you're just describing, sometimes you're going to find you need an extra step. I don't need 10 extra steps, but I need one. Oh, well, maybe I need one more, but that's enough. And then it finishes it off. So in that, metaphorically, it is very much like art. You know when you're done.
Yeah.
It's a satisfying unity that composition.
Yeah, but I also think that it's just as hard to know when to be done scientifically as it is aesthetically, right? Like I said, I think the most common example that anybody can relate to is that photo editing, right? If you took a photo on your phone and all you want to do is the very simple task of editing the photo in such a way that it looks like what your eye actually saw in real life, you start making changes, and those changes are additive, right? So the first one, you might go, oh, okay, well, by adjusting the temperature of the photo, now it looks good. But it's not quite right. So now I'm going to adjust the contrast. Well, the contrast interacts with the warmth that you added in such a way. And then that interacts with the saturation, and that interacts with this. And then all of a sudden you get to a point where you go, no, I don't know when it happened, but at some point it went overboard. At some point it went too far. That happens not just aesthetically, but that also happens in explanatory science or philosophy as well, where you're doing something and you go, okay, yeah, now it makes sense. And then this happens to me at work all the time. Yeah, now this machine will work right. And, one of the engineers will go, yeah, but if you took out that and that and that, and then just put a line straight there, you have a lot less things that are going to break. Sure, what you did will work, but there's a lot of things that could break between here and there, as opposed to if you just did this. And I go, oh, okay, that makes so much more sense now, but I couldn't see it that way when I started the process.
Right. It's a scaffolding. It's a rather rapid, it doesn't feel like it, but kind of scaffolding. One of my go-tos, Star Trek. Scotty sabotages a much newer starship than the Enterprise in one of the movies. And Kirk says, Scotty, it's a miracle. And no, sir, the more they complicate the plumbing, the easier it is to stop up the drain. That's Occam's razor. Yeah.
You hear a lot of people complain about it with, new cars. Why they put these computers and everything? Everything is so easy to break. Well, and then you're looking at trade-offs, right? Are there more pieces that could break? Yes. But is there also significantly more functionality than you would have had in cars from 30 or 40 years ago? Yes. So, that's sort of, again, a scientific or physical representation of our neuroscience thing, right? okay, well, it's getting more complex, but it is also adding more features. So,
my dad's a mechanic, and he's retired, and he has a new car. He's never had a new car before. He has this new car that he's leasing, and the things that he comes to about it, he's coming to it from the viewpoint of a life of experience with cars, and I respect that. But it's also how I liked it back when, right? And everything from, I think his primary issue is not that there are so many different buttons and so on. It's that what he thinks are the necessary things aren't foregrounded. So he was looking for what used to be called the cigarette lighter, but now it's just the plug in for charging things. And I found it, or actually he managed to find it. I couldn't even see it at first. We were looking where it generally would be. He found it by shining a flashlight, and it's way down underneath a shelf. And he said, "This is what I'm talking about. That's something that people would use. Why should that be hidden? Because engineers are just trying to make everything look so pretty." And I said, "No, it's not just a matter of aesthetics." But we were getting into this, right?
Yeah.
And is this what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think cars are a really great example because they do combine a lot of things that people find important. They have to be scientific and engineering marvels. You need to make them compact. You need to make them accessible. They have to function a certain way. We want them to look good. We want them to do all of these things.
We want them not to pollute as much. Well, some of us do, but
yeah,
those are all complicated things.
Yeah. So yeah, Occam's razor, when you're looking at these things, becomes very interesting. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that any criticism of a new thing is curmudgeonly, right? I remember the one that really got to me was when I got a new car, and it was a coupe. It was a 2-door car, and the only option was power windows and locks. Mm-hmm. And I go, now this is where Occam's razor would come in handy, right? Because it would be much cheaper. It would be much more reliable. It would be much safer to just have windows that I can roll down and locks that I can manually use, right? Because especially we've mentioned with where we live, your windows will freeze up. If you accidentally hit your power window button, you'll burn out the motor, and then you can't use your window anymore. And it's an inexpensive thing to fix. Power windows are much slower than manual windows, right? And if I only have 2 doors on my car and I can easily reach and hit that other one, I feel like does that mean that all coupes should come with manual locks and windows? No, because if you have an older person or a person of shorter stature who can't reach over and do it, or whatever the case, you should have the
limitations on motions. There should be options. Yeah.
But yeah. So it's an interesting employment of it. Do you want to let's talk about Occam's broom now?
I love this one because it's relatively new, and Occam didn't come up. A guy named Sidney Brentner came up with it. But it's essentially, he calls it, Dennett calls it an anti-thinking tool, as one, because when you're the classic, right? If you're cleaning your house and you've got all this, you're sweeping the dust. Sometimes people lift up a rug and sweep the dust under, rather than just putting it in the pan and then putting it in the garbage can. It's sloppy, right? It's allowing oneself off the hook. In some ways, it's not removing what's there; it's just hiding what's there, and that's why it's an anti-thinking kind of thing. So it essentially is about the rather childlike, in some ways, notion that you can't see what's there. So if I hide some things, then I'll make a nice theory or a nice explanation for how things work, and I don't have to take into account that stuff that's not there. Which reminds me of a moment long ago when my then fiance and I in college were taking care of a faculty member's daughter. We were close with the faculty, and the girl was, I think, 4 years old. And I won't repeat exactly what she said, but she was in the bathtub, and we could hear her muttering something, and My fiance was sitting watching her, and I was just outside the door. Boom, 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 boom. She was cursing. Under the and when my fiance went over, and the now wife, she went, "What's going on? You can't hear me because my ears are under the water." And she was just saying these curse words because they were fun to say, but she thought she was perfectly fine doing it because, that to me is Occam's broom.
Right.
You can't hear it, so it's okay that I'm doing it.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of interesting ways that this can be represented. I think, in the book he talks about bad science being done that way, right? Where, okay, I design a study. So I start out from a certain theoretical perspective. I start out with a certain bias in my study design. I conduct the study, and then I choose a statistical method that sort of is copacetic with the results that I want to see, and then I write a paper that either doesn't talk about or downplays other theoretical perspectives, presents my treatment of the scenario as being objective and clear of any sort of bias. Don't mention the employment of the statistical procedure as being possibly not appropriate to the study design, or the study design not being appropriate to the thing that you're trying to look at, and then putting it out there as something that is, well, here's a scientific discovery, right? Which is something that we talked about. I think it was last week. I was talking about it with psychology, where some of these outdated psychological concepts, these reductionist ones, will stick around because of you have the simplest number of things, right? X causes Y. That's much easier for a news article to publish on. It's much easier for a layperson to understand. And so that's Occam's broom, right? Oh, well, look, we have a few number of elements, and so it's much easier,
Until we forget that correlation does not mean causation.
Yeah, right. Or that there's possible other explanations for what we found, or that maybe the things the way that we looked at it wasn't necessarily appropriate.
And this can fool anybody.
Oh yeah.
So when he in the book, Dennett talks about Thomas Nagel, who's a major philosopher, who was somewhat taken in by a book 10, 15 years ago that purported to have some explanations that seemed almost elegant, received great reviews and everything, but it was never vetted by other scientists. And because the assumption was, whether the assumption was planted by the writer or it was just how it worked, I'm not going to try to go there, but the assumption was that it had been vetted, that it had been had input from other scientists practicing in cellular genetics and cellular science, and it wasn't. And so it got this stamp of approval enthusiastically from a top-level philosopher, and sort of off.
Yeah. And this is, like you said, it can fool anybody, and it's something that, a lot of this stuff, you learn a little bit by bit as you go through school. But I mean, I'm halfway through a doctoral program now, and I'm still learning ways of identifying bad science, right? And you go, oh, okay, so this thing that I thought was scientific, pretty well grounded in good science, really wasn't, and that makes you rethink, how you approach knowledge, epistemologically, and how you look for what things are true.
And it requires you to question your own assumptions so much. And I think it's reasonably safe to say, as a universal, that human beings fall back immediately in a reactionary word, the word you used before, sense, to be on the defensive, to respond to something outrageous, and falling back to really thinking about, well, what is it that's setting me off about this? What are the issues going on? You can still find reasons to be justifiably outraged or troubled or whatever it happens to be, but at least you are trying to think to yourself. You're not jumped. Another one of those Occam's razor things that I think is applicable is husband arrives home late from work. Is the first thought that he's out having an affair, or that there's been an accident, he's in trouble, and oh no, or is it just bad traffic that day? Well, okay, you take that and you apply it to Occam's broom, and the husband, if he were not behaving in a way that might be ethical for his spouse, might find reasons to shove the other stuff up. Here's a story that I've told to cover myself, or it may just be that it was bad traffic. Right? It was both Occam's razor and Occam's broom are meant to make us really think about the proposition or the idea that's put before us. A kid fails an English test, and the kid's immediate response is, well, that teacher's against me, that teacher's been against me all the way through. The teacher designed the test so that I would fail, and so on. Now, it's not inconceivable that in one particular situation, in a low moment, that might have happened, but it's unlikely that was done. More likely is that the kid hasn't yet learned some of the things that test was asking about, which doesn't mean that the child couldn't learn it. It might mean, well, it wasn't presented in ways the child could understand, or the child just wasn't paying attention. Any number of possibilities, but to immediately leap to somebody's trying to get me, that is our go-to Occam's razor misread, Occam's broom at full speed.
Yeah. I think that the important thing with it, as in much of what we talk about, is that Occam's razor and broom, these aren't static principles. It's very contextually based. So like in your first example, right, we can say, okay, well, it's ridiculous for the wife to jump to the conclusion that the husband's cheating. But the length of time he's gone really matters, right? If he disappeared for 7 years and came back, maybe you'd have a different explanation.
Man, I had a wrong turn here.
Yeah. You might have a different explanation than if he was late 5 minutes, right? And the same thing with any of these scenarios is that I think an important part of employing these tools is to readily identify the context that it is. Like you said, why would you assume the hoof prints are zebras? Well, if you're in Africa, that might be a logical thing. There's context to it, and I think that does help us identify some of the Occam's broom things. Right? I can't remember all of the examples that he used in the book to help identify them, but I know anecdotally. Some of the things that I've found in academia, right, is simple explanations, oversimplified explanations for complex phenomenon, will appear as Occam's razor initially, but under further scrutiny will fall apart, right? The language that is used by an academic in presenting results is important. If there's really no need for somebody who is pretty self-assured that they're doing good science to take an adversarial or disparaging tone of another scientific theory, right? You can point out flaws. You can advocate your own theory with self-assured confidence in an objective way if you believe that what you're presenting is the truth, right? Citations. If what I ran across this in one article that I was reading, where the author was using adversarial language towards another paradigm. And then on top of that, he had citations all throughout his work, right? But it was the same 6 people, over and over and over again, right? There was no diversity in it, and so what that tells you is that there's no scientific consensus that this is the correct approach. Mm-hmm. There's a small group of people in the academic community that agree, and then they just pat each other on the back about what they've found.
And they might not be wrong, but it's not a representative,
right?
And so the caution. Dennett says, this is a quotation, Brenner coined the term Occam's broom. When he did, he wasn't talking about creationism and conspiracy theories. He was pointing out that in the heat of battle, even serious scientists sometimes cannot resist overlooking some data that seriously undermine their theory. It's a temptation that must be resisted no matter what. If the data tells you something, then you go with it. The trouble is when people start making up data.
yeah. Which happens occasionally, but much more commonly, it's what you just mentioned, where and this doesn't necessarily have to be a necessarily what's the word I'm looking for? Not malignant, but it doesn't have to be malign approach, right? Where what will happen is if you're operating at the level of academia where you are going to make cutting edge discoveries, you're going to have to do a lot of research, right? And so I think that what Occam's broom really comes down to is that a good academic, right, is going to look at all of the research that's been done in the field and then form new conclusions based off of that. But what happens more commonly than we'd like to admit is that the scientist who has, like we've talked about, is a human being with their own biases, with their own perspectives, doesn't read all of the literature in the field. What they read is the literature that coincides with their opinions and with their biases, and then tries to make a new discovery based off of that information. So it's not necessarily that they were trying to mislead people in that case, but it's just they're operating from an incomplete picture of what the field is actually saying because they didn't even bother to read or interact with research that it was not done from their point of view.
Right. And there are enormous capitalistic pressures.
Yeah.
As research and development diminishes, what's supposed to come out of research and development, the expectation increases. And so mighty hard to resist not giving in to that. Pop culture gives us those things. What happened to Norman Osborn in the Spider-Man movies? He didn't want to take all of his serum. He didn't want to take it back to formula the way his board told him to. No, I'm going to drink it now and I'm going to become the Green Goblin. That's goofy, but it's really a fun little cartoon for it.
Yeah, and you see it happening nowadays. I was just reading an article the other day about a longevity researcher who he had this idea that this certain compound was going to aid with longevity, but he didn't want to wait for it to go through clinical trials, so he just started injecting himself with it. And had been doing it for a while. That is a dangerous way to go. So I think that leads us to the last question, which is there a danger in employing a tool like Occam's razor? Does the razor cut both ways? Or if it's properly employed, it works, but we can operate under assumptions that maybe lead us to think we're using it, but we're actually not.
Yes. It does cut both ways depending on your intent. Really, it's your intention. If your intention is to try to think clearly and you're using it as a principle, not as it must be this way. Let's try out the rule of thumb and see what fits and what doesn't here. It doesn't mean you're ruling out complexity. But if you follow it as a law, it can lead you the wrong way because it can rule out unnecessary complexity. And if you're just going to throw it out because it's not simple, then we go back to the word simple. So yeah, I think it does. I think it cuts both ways.
Yeah, I guess a razor can give you a shave, but can cut you too.
Cuts you too.
So until next time, keep pondering.